Number 259, BUFFOONS. By 22 minutes special standards, this is pretty great. By actual episode standards, it's just good. Number 258, Bubbletown. This episode has one gaping hole in the story. SpongeBob gets locked in a bubble jail. He can just pop the bubbles and walk out. And it's not like the writers forgot. They bring this up in the episode. Number 257, Shell Games. This episode has a definitely interesting concept. I just don't think the story is interesting enough to live up to it. Number 256, Hooky. I like some of the jokes here, but one problem I have is that it seems that Krabs' reaction to what happens is treated as a worse consequence than potential death. Number 255, Reef Blower. I actually think this episode could have been funnier with dialogue. Number 254, Rule of Dumb. Some people find Patrick's meanness to be a problem, and some find it funny. I'm in the middle, where I find it just be similar enough to Driven to Tears to get a pass. Number 253, Bummer Vacation. This episode is kind of cruel to SpongeBob for no reason. Even with that though, I wouldn't consider it to be too big of a problem with the episode. Number 252, Pranks a Lot. This episode is one of the weaker ones of Season 3, which actually says a lot. Seeing SpongeBob and Patrick be publicly humiliated seems a bit cruel for what they did in the episode. Number 251, My Leg. This episode is kind of overrated. I think there are some funny moments, but I think this episode should have been 22 minutes. It certainly does have a pacing problem. Number 250, The Masterpiece. I like this episode and I enjoy the plot of it. It's not super funny, but it's got a decent amount of jokes. Number 249, The Curse of Bikini Bottom. This episode is kind of dry, but it's got some little moments in it that got a laugh out of me. Number 248, Krusty Catering. This episode is one that doesn't blow me away, but I still enjoy watching it. Number 247, The Great Patty Caper. Although the title is confusing, the actual episode is really fun and actually feels like an adventure. Number 246, Trident Trouble. This episode gives more screen time to King Neptune, which is definitely a good thing, and most of the time his episodes are pretty good. Note that I said most of the time. Number 245, Safe Deposit Crabs. This episode is just a Krabs plot that works for the character. Number 244, Eek and Urchin. This episode is a kind of dry one, but there are enough jokes to pull it up. Number 243, Sports. This episode isn't one I'd call funny, but instead I'd call it amusing. Number 242, Appointment TV. This episode is just one that seems natural for SpongeBob, the show and the character. Number 241, King Plankton. This episode is one that proves to me that they're not running out of ideas. If they can come up with something like this and make it work, then the sky's the limit. Number 240, Knock Knock Who's There. This episode reminds me a bit of the Slumber Party, but I think this episode has enough good qualities to stand on its own. Number 239, Karen's Baby. So this episode is weird, but I don't mind that. Sometimes weirdness can be done well. Number 238, The Goofy Newbie. This episode is just one of those classic Patrick episodes. Enough said. Number 237, Pat the Horse. This episode's concept is so weird, but honestly that's why it works. Number 236, Moving Bubble Bass. This episode gives screen time to a criminally underused character and proves why he should be used more. Number 235, Karate Star. Some people are going to find Patrick to be annoying here, but honestly, I don't really think it's too awful. Overall, it's just an action-packed and overall funny episode. Number 234, Tea at the Tree Dome. This episode is a bit slow compared to what comes after it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. Number 233, The Checkup. This episode can be a bit torturous at times, but the jokes did land. Number 232, Model Sponge. Yes, the episode about SpongeBob becoming a porn star. And you know what? The joke actually works because they don't go too disturbing with it. Also, they don't explicitly say that SpongeBob's becoming a porn star, but you can kind of read between the lines on that one. Number 231, Selling Out. It's a funny episode that I think is kind of sad at parts, but overall, the story is what makes the episode good. Number 230, Mustard O' Mine. This episode isn't one that'll be making anyone's top 10 lists, but it's still enjoyable enough. Number 229, Tunnel of Glove. This episode has some good parts to it, but nothing I consider groundbreaking. Number 228, Two Thumbs Down. This episode is a pretty standard SpongeBob plot, but it also proves why the tried and true formula works. Number 227, Code Yellow. My first inclination was to hate this episode because of SpongeBob's incompetence, but honestly, I can't really hate it too much. It's really action-packed and is decently funny at times. Number 226, Sharks vs. Pods. While the episode might be a bit cliched, other times I think it actually does a good job deconstructing some of those cliches. Number 225, Mooncation. This episode has a fun location and a fun atmosphere, and not much else. Number 224, Shanghaied. If this episode could pick an ending and stick with it, maybe I'd like it more. The only thing keeping it down is honestly the awful redubbing of the patchy segments. Number 223, Krabby Road. This episode is kind of funny, but not the most hilarious episode or anything like that. Number 222, Born to be Wild. The twist really hit the first time I watched this episode, but more and more the plot shows its flaws. Still really funny though. Number 221, Squid on Strike. This is just the kind of plot that's ripe for max joke potential, and it delivers. Number 220, Mrs. Puff, You're Fired. This is one of those solid Season 4 episodes. Not as funny as the first 3 seasons, but honestly probably a better story than most of the ones in the first 3 seasons. Number 219, The Krusty Bucket. This episode is one of the weirdest episodes I've ever seen. I'm not sure if this plot is supposed to be a joke or if the joke is that we're not supposed to take the plot seriously. Either way, it was an enjoyable watch. Number 218, Hall Monitor. I enjoyed this one. It's not the best, but it's certainly not bad either. Number 217, Greasy Buffoons. This episode can be gross at times, but don't let that distract from the action-packed plot this episode brings. Number 216, Whale Watching. This episode is one of the funnier ones in Season 11, but what keeps it a bit lower than it would be is that Squidward is kind of out of character here. There's just something off about him. Number 215, Skill Crane. This is a classic Squidward escalation plot, and the formula works for a reason. Number 214, The Krusty Slammer. I have to say, this episode is one that I enjoyed, even if some of Season 12's cliches are present here. It's still enjoyable overall. Number 213, Sleepy Time. One of the more subdued episodes. This one I actually think is underrated. Number 212, Life Insurance. This episode just proves why the Squid Sponge Pat formula can work so well. Number 211, Help Wanted. Ah yes, the first episode. It's not the best or even the funniest, but I can certainly see why this show was beloved in the conceptual stage of its creation. Number 210, Cracked Crabs. This episode actually knows how to do a Mr. Krabs plot revolving around his cheapness, and it's done right as well. Number 209, Pre-Hibernation Week. I enjoy this episode, but the further into the episode you get, the slower the plot gets. It's still good though. Number 208, Fools in April. Seeing heartfelt moments like Squidward actually feeling bad is something the show seems to be missing nowadays. Number 207, Wishing You Well. This episode is one of the first that I remember watching on TV, and I think Past Me has some good taste. Number 206, Bumper to Bumper. I enjoy some of the humor here and the visuals we get, but my one gripe is that SpongeBob really has no reason to suddenly suck at driving after the improvements he makes. Number 205, It Came from Goo Lagoon. This episode is really good, especially by 22-minute standards. The show seems to have a hard time doing those episodes particularly well. Number 204, Walking the Plankton. Of the vacation episodes, this one sticks out the most to me. Number 203, Back to the Past. I enjoy the interesting style they tried to go with, but unfortunately the ending kills the mood for me. Otherwise, this might be a top 50 episode. Number 202, Welcome to the Bikini Bottom Triangle. This episode is pretty good, but it doesn't stick out in my mind as overly funny or an overly interesting story. Number 201, I'm Your Biggest Fanatic. I like the jokes the episode is built on. Steven Hillenburg often said he designed SpongeBob as a nerd, so seeing that side of him be more fleshed out is honestly quite nice. Number 200, Gary in Love. This episode manages to make me enjoy a plotline I usually don't like in most shows, so props there. Number 199, Best Frenemies. A lot of shows have done the whole enemies working together shtick, and this episode works very well in that regard. Number 198, Barnacle Face. This episode is a Pearl plot that manages to not be stale and cliched, so you have to appreciate that. Number 197, Bossy Boots. There's not much to say here, the episode is just really funny. Number 196, The Hot Shot. The episode Lives and Dies by Tony Fast Jr., and thank Neptune he's a good character. Number 195, Squirrel Jokes. The episode is decently funny, tells a good story, and has a nice lesson baked in, which is really nice. Number 194, Sandy's Nutmare. This episode actually has a decent moral, which is surprisingly rare for this show. I realize I said that for the last entry, but still. Number 193, The Bully. For a bullying plotline, this episode is done really well. Number 192, Squidward in Clarinet Land. This episode's only fault is that Squidward doesn't get to Clarinet Land soon enough, and so the episode seems a bit cluttered. Number 191, The Pink Purloiner. This episode is one that I just enjoyed watching. It doesn't do one thing particularly well, but as a whole it's a good episode. Number 190, Ghost Host. This episode gives us a unique premise with the Flying Dutchman and his backstory, and that is certainly admirable. Number 189, Squid's Day Off. This episode is an example of Squid torture done right because it's a more psychological torture that is Squidward's own fault. Number 188, Buried in Time. This episode could have easily been boring, as we've seen with other Season 7 episodes. It's a miracle this episode wasn't boring. Number 187, Mind the Gap. This episode, while light on plot, is still pretty funny, and is an enjoyable watch. My condolences to any British viewers. Number 186, Sentimental Sponge. This is just an example of a plot that really fits with the show. Number 185, The Lost Mattress. Season 4 was one of the more story-focused seasons, and this episode is a good example of that. Number 184, Patty Hype. I enjoyed this episode, but the reason it's not higher is the dull, depressing tone of the first part of the episode. It's just so out of character for the whole show, you wouldn't expect something like that. Number 183, Pickles. This is Bubble Bass's first episode, and I gotta say, it's a pretty good episode to be his first. Number 182, Boating School. For being the first Boating School episode, it introduces the concept pretty well. Number 181, Cave Dwelling Sponge. While Spongebob might be a bit oblivious here, I think Spongy Spongy is funny enough that it can hold its own. Number 180, Valentine's Day. For a Valentine's Day episode, it does its job. I actually feel that this particular episode could have been done with Patrick's birthday with minimal changes. Maybe instead of a Valentine's Day carnival, it takes place at Glove World or something like that. Number 179, Karate Choppers. While this episode's plot seems to be based on a misunderstanding, it's funny enough for me to ignore its faults. Number 178, Muscle Bob Buff Pants. This episode is actually really funny, deceptively so for how it seems to be talked about. Number 177, Surf and Turf. While at first this episode may seem like your run-of-the-mill SpongeBob episode, the ending portion is so action-packed I really enjoyed it. Number 176, Welk Attack. This episode's plot is constantly moving, which is a plus. It's also the first one I'm aware of that mentions the events of a previous episode. Number 175, The Slumber Party. This episode is a classic try to get into a place you're locked out of story, executed pretty well. Number 174, The Krusty Plate. This episode is a Season 5 short that I really enjoy, even if there is only one joke. If the joke's gonna be big, it's gonna have to take up the whole short. Number 173, Arg. This episode is a lot of fun, middle section notwithstanding. Number 172, Ripped Pants. This episode is honestly a bit overrated, but I still enjoy it nonetheless. Number 171, The Chaperone. This episode is good, but a bit light on jokes by Season 1 standards. Number 170, Squidward's School for Grown-Ups. This episode is really funny, even if it's a bit light on story. Number 169, The Legend of Bikini Bottom. This episode is honestly really cool, but I don't know if I'd like it without the stop motion. The plot is kind of bare bones when you look at it with a critical eye. Number 168, and we have another episode that is only this high because of the visuals. Without them, this episode would be bland and boring. Number 167, The Inside Job. While this episode treads territory that was covered in Season 1, this episode is unique enough and funny enough to still be good on its own. Number 166, Scaredy Pants. This was the first Halloween episode and for a while the only one. It's a pretty neat watch. Number 165, Grandpappy the Pirate. This episode manages to introduce an interesting character and expand on Krabs' backstory. Not bad at all. Number 164, Home Sweet Pineapple. This episode is one where, even upon original viewing, you know won't have much in the way of stakes. Why exactly would they get rid of the first line of the theme song in Season 1? It still manages to be enjoyable though. Number 163, The Grill Is Gone. This episode isn't really about what the title says, but it still manages to be enjoyable nonetheless. Number 162, Tutor Sauce. This episode is a boating school episode that's not about boating school, and it manages to develop Mr. Krabs a little, which is definitely appreciated. Number 161, Opposite Day. While some people might consider the first season to be really slow compared to each subsequent one, this episode is the exception to that rule. 160, Krusty Concessionaires. This episode is one that manages to have multiple coinciding plots at one venue and not have one of them be completely boring. That is something to celebrate, definitely.